Welcome to this week's episode of Motivational Moments. My name is Saif Alsafir. Let's dive in. Thank you for tuning into this episode of Motivational Moments. Last week we looked at the third proverb and we talked about seeking direction in your life and having a purpose in your life. If you didn't get a chance to watch that video, I will link the video down in the description below. Make sure you get a chance to watch that after this video. This week, what are we going to be looking at this week to help you and build you up, edify you, motivate you to get after it this week and do the best in everything that you are going to do for the sake of God? Well, this week we're going to be in 2 Corinthians chapter 12. And we're going to be looking at 2 Corinthians chapter 12, and we're going to be looking at verses 9 and 10 in particular. And this is Paul writing about a difficult time that he was having and about difficult times that he had been having in general. We're not going to get deep into the context of this. We're really just going to look at the overall principle of what Paul was getting at in the context of 2 Corinthians chapter 12 and verses 9 and 10. And we will use that to draw a couple comparisons throughout the scriptures, and the rest will be yours, and hopefully it will edify you and lift you up. So I'll be reading out of the ESV. Grab your Bible, follow along with me, and let's read. 2 Corinthians chapter 12, starting in verse 9 and in verse 10. But he said to me, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, then, I am content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. For when I am weak, then I am strong." So let's start by acknowledging that what Paul says here, to some degree, whether it's a great degree, a small degree, and sometimes different days dictates this, we all can relate. That is the point. We can relate to what Paul is saying. When Paul talks about, in verse 10, his weaknesses, dealing with insults, hardships, persecutions, calamities, most of us will relate to one of those or several of those, and depending on what season of our life we're in, more than others. And the intensity of those things might be greater at one time in our life more than others. So what can we take away from this? Well, if you're like me and you're like most people, you will spend some time thinking about your weaknesses in your life. And not just your weaknesses or, am I good at this or bad at this? Of course, we do think about those things. But we think about the hardships in our life, and we think about the difficulties in our life. It's a bit of a natural human thing to look at ourselves, to look at our lives, and to think, this might be difficult or that might be difficult. So we do that at times. Well, what this passage can teach us, ultimately, is really embedded in verse 9. But he said to me, and here's where he quotes in red, if you're looking in your Bible, where Jesus is speaking and saying, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." So ultimately, verse 9 is saying that the Lord's power is made perfect in your weakness. This is not a new thing that we're seeing here. I'm going to give you 3 brief examples that you can take away, and there are plenty more of examples, but I'd like to give you just these 3 that will hopefully help you recognize that the Lord's power is perfected in your weakness, and that you should not be ashamed of your weaknesses, but in fact, boast in your weaknesses, as did Paul. So the first example we're going to consider is from the Old Testament, and this would be Sarah, the wife to Abraham. Now Sarah was barren for at least 25 years, and although God had promised Abraham and Sarah that they would have a child, they were not able to have a child up until this point. So Sarah and Abraham were promised a son by God. And of course, Sarah laughed to herself about this, and Abraham actually laughed about this because of their age. They were so far advanced in age. In fact, Sarah was 90 years old when she bore Isaac. Now, if you've ever known anybody who has had difficulty conceiving children, or if you yourself have had difficulty in some shape or form conceiving children, you know that this is a very difficult thing to go through. And oftentimes we wonder why, we struggle with this. It's a difficult thing to deal with. And what we see here is that even at 90 years old, when Sarah bore Isaac, God can have his will be done through the weakness of other people. Or in other words, as we considered in 2 Corinthians 12, verse 9 and 10, the Lord's power is perfected in our weakness. Of course, the significance of Isaac is that God would establish his covenant through Isaac. The second person that we'll speak about is also from the Old Testament, and that would be Moses. And Moses is essentially the spokesperson to the people of Israel and to Egypt, and to just be the spokesperson for God at this time. Now, why we would find that pretty significant is because Moses, let's say, weakness or his struggle is Moses was not a good speaker. Moses says himself, I am not a man of words. I am slow in speech and slow in tongue. Moses does not recognize himself as a good speaker. Some have even debated on whether he had some type of stutter or slurring or something like that, something of the nature of a stutter. Nonetheless, not somebody that you would expect God to choose to be his spokesperson to the people. And nonetheless, Moses is chosen. Another great example where God's power is perfected in someone's weakness. And the final one we'll consider is the Apostle Paul. And of course, the Apostle Paul is an unlikely, extremely unlikely convert to Christianity because he was advancing in Judaism beyond his contemporaries. He was very well known for even persecuting the church, the Christians. So Paul would be this unlikely convert that would convert to Christianity via his interaction with Christ, and then would go on to write the majority of our New Testament epistles. Again, another example of someone that, on the face of it, you would not think that God would use for his purposes, and yet God used him greatly. So what's the ultimate takeaway for you? The point is that if you find yourself dealing with hardships, persecutions, you look at your own flaws, your own weaknesses, and you think, God can't use me. How can God use me? I'm missing this. I'm missing this. I'm struggling with this. I'm dealing with this. Surely God can't use me. That is absolutely not true. And it certainly wasn't true in the case of Sarah. It wasn't true in the case of Moses. And it wasn't true in the case of Paul. Now, I've just given you 3 examples. There is an entire litany of examples that we could give from the Bible of people that were used by God that would certainly seem unlikely characters to be using to support God's purposes and his will throughout this world. And yet, God done it. How is that possible? Again, I'll leave you one more time with 2 Corinthians 12 and verse 9. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. The Lord's power is made perfect in your weakness. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope that you'll take your weaknesses even and boast in them, knowing that you will be perfected in your weaknesses through the Lord. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, share it with others. Don't forget to leave a comment as well about things that you might want to hear about. And until next time, we'll see you.